Hi, good morning, everybody. Welcome to this week's Tariff Trends Updates 2025. We do these every couple of weeks, and great to have another one here on the other side of the 232 tariff. For the first, my name is Marcus Eamon. I'm a Senior Customs Manager here at Flexport, and we have a really good webinar here today to talk about a few things. A quick couple of housekeeping notes. On your screen, you'll see a sidebar on the right-hand side of the main stage. If at any time you see you need assistance during the live webinar, please message us in that help chat located in the sidebar. You can also ask questions via the Q&A on the sidebar. Time permitting, at the end of the presentation, we'll be able to answer some of these questions. Try to get your questions in early if you want to have yours answered. In the menu above your screen, you'll see that you have two tabs. In the first tab, you can download a copy of today's slide deck. And in the second tab, there's a brief feedback survey for this webinar. We always love feedback. We read those after every time. We try to incorporate what you want to hear about into our next one so it continues to be relevant for you. So please do fill that out before you exit today's webinar. Now for a brief legal note. Please keep in mind that all the information provided in this session is based on the situation at this current time and may not be customized to your specific business requirements, especially important to keep in mind in today's tariff environment. We always recommend reaching out to a Flexport expert to discuss your particular situation. Okay, and next slide. Joining me today are my colleagues, Anna Zajic, Senior Trade Advisory Manager, and Angela Lewis, the Global Head of Customs for Flexport. And now we have our agenda today. So we're going to start off with covering the latest news that are kind of what's the latest breaking thing for tariffs these days, followed by what were some of the 232 changes that we saw go into effect last week, 312. We're also going to talk a little bit about USMCA because that is also now continues to be an important thing to note, especially with that temporary stay on the 25% IEPA. I want to make sure we have a good understanding of that. We also want to talk about what is the future news? What are maybe some of the things just around the corner here that we're keeping our eyes on, and we want you to keep your eyes on as we go through the rest of March and into April. We will then close it out with our Q&A. So with that, Angela, why don't you tell us a little bit about some of the latest news? What's been going on in March?
Yeah, thanks so much, Marcus. So we thought we'd start by looking at March and what has transpired so far this month. It's been a lot. First thing, on Monday, March 3rd, the White House confirmed that the administration was indeed moving forward with implementing the 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, also known as IEPA. The Trump administration claimed that despite the 30-day stay, neither Mexico or Canada had adequately addressed the situation, and thus the tariffs would be implemented effective just after midnight on March 4th. That same day, a new executive order stated that China and Hong Kong tariffs would also be increasing from 10% to 20%, also effective after midnight on March 4th as well. In doing this, the exclusion for Chinese goods that departed before February 1st expired not on March 7th, as previously communicated, but on March 4th instead. And just a few days later, on March 6th, the Trump administration posted, or Trump himself actually, posted on Truth Social that Mexico would not be required to pay the full tariffs on anything that applied under USMCA, and that this exclusion would only be effective until April 2nd. He stated that he was doing this to accommodate President Sheinbaum of Mexico, who he has a very good relationship with, and who is working very hard to stop illegal aliens and fentanyl from entering the U.S. That tweet was quickly followed by an amendment to the executive orders, which allow goods from Mexico and Canada to comply with USMCA, to be exempt from IEPA duties. He also reduced the tariff for potash, which is mined and manufactured salts that contain potassium, from 25% to 10% for both Canada and Mexico. Now, all of these changes were effective on after midnight on March 7th. So it's really important to note here that goods from Canada or Mexico that arrived in the U.S. on March 4th, 5th, or 6th are still subject to the 25% IEPA duties, regardless of USMCA applicability. Now, on March 8th, we got a bit of a surprise when China announced retaliatory tariffs against Canadian agricultural products, as well as some food products. Now, those won't be effective until March 20th, but these retaliatory tariffs were a direct response to tariffs that Canada had levied against China last year. So, why the time? It wasn't stated explicitly, but this was definitely seen as a warning to both Canada and Mexico not to align too closely with the US, and clearly a sign that the US isn't the only country willing to take punches on their trading partner right now. Now, if we go back to the US and less than 24 hours before the new 232 tariffs were scheduled to go into effect, Ontario's Premier, Doug Ford, announced that he would be placing a 25% tariff on electricity going to New York, Michigan, and Minnesota until Trump backed down on all Canadian tariffs. But in true Trump fashion, he responded by instead threatening to increase the 232 tariffs to 50%. Now, lucky for us, they backed down very quickly in the early afternoon once Ford backed off his electricity surcharge. So, as we prepared for the originally intended 25% 232 steel and aluminum tariffs, Customs published a late afternoon CSMS certifying not only that the steel and aluminum tariffs would be in effect on 3/12, but their derivatives as well. Now, this implementation also ended all existing exclusions, replaced by one exclusion only for products that were smelted or poured in the US. And I'm not going to go into too much detail here, as Marcus will talk way more in depth on 232 in the next section. But also on March 12th, Canada and the EU retaliated with their own tariffs. Canada chose to enact more reciprocal tariffs targeting steel and aluminum and derivatives, effective immediately at a blanket rate of 25%, while the EU has taken a two-prong approach. The first being to implement previously held tariffs that were originally created in response to the original 232 tariffs of 2018 and 2020, and covered a wide range of US goods from food to motorcycles. Now, in the negotiations in a couple years ago, these tariffs were originally held off due to the quota exclusions that have now been revoked. So, with the suspension of these quotas and the new 232 tariffs, the EU has decided to implement, effective April 1st, these original tariffs. The EU also decided to scope additional measures with the goal of ensuring that the total value of EU tariffs match the total trade impact of US tariffs. So this second approach has been kicked off, and it was kicked off on March 12th with a 2-week consultation of EU stakeholders. There's an expected rollout now slated for mid-April. And it came as no surprise after this announcement that on March 13th, Trump posted again on Truth Social that the European Union had just put a nasty 50% tariff on US whiskey. If the tariffs were not removed immediately, Trump said the US will shortly place 200% tariffs on wine, champagne, and alcohol products coming out of France and other EU represented countries. This will be great for wine and champagne businesses in the US, Trump said. Now, the EU has since stated they are open to negotiations, with the French Prime Minister calling the EU tax a mistake. The implementation is about 15 days away, and we just had a new Prime Minister sworn into Canada on Friday. So there's no doubt that this game of global chess, tariff chess that is, will continue not only through the end of this month, but also into April. And although there's been plenty of news, plenty of tweets, and a little bit of backtracking this month, I think the most difficult and complex change that we've actually seen has been the 232 changes. So I'll turn it back over to Marcus now to give an in-depth look of what's going on with Section 232.
Yeah, thanks for breaking all those things down. There's been quite a lot in the last few weeks here. So let's talk about a little bit about 232. I used this slide last time to kind of go over it. I made some slight adjustments because I said, well, we don't know when exactly the last list of derivatives are going to go into effect, except they also in fact go into effect on the 12th as well. A few hours just before Secretary Lutnick did certify that Customs had all the procedures in place to efficiently collect duties and process these entries, which was largely correct, but we'll talk into a couple of those challenges later. So what are these 232 duties on? It comes in basically 4 buckets. And the way I've been describing it is that the first bucket are the original list of primary mill products, both steel and aluminum made. They got a refresh with a new 99 specialty code to use. Any of those exclusions were sunset. and except for just a couple of niche ones for importers specific. And that was true for both steel and aluminum. The second bucket is the old list of derivative products of steel or aluminum that also got a refresh. Those also had exclusion sunset. But what's new about it are in the gray boxes here. We have two new lists of derivatives for intra-chapter 73 derivatives and extra-chapter 73 derivatives. Likewise, for aluminum, we have intra within chapter 76 derivatives and extra 76 derivatives. And I kind of give a few examples here, but these are actually fairly broad, and they kind of come up, I think, fairly often, where we see, grills, tableware, ovens, screws, nuts, bolts, sinks, other kind of sanitary ware. Those are affected here. And then for the ones that are outside of Chapter 73, I do want to call out that only applies to the steel or aluminum value within those derivative products. So if you have if you have metal furniture that's within Chapter 73 and part of it's plastic and part of it's steel, well, you only have to pay the 232 duties on the value of the steel contained in that metal table, for instance. You wouldn't have to pay the 25% on the plastic. There is also a note here. I want to see the exception for both the intra 73 products and also the extra 73, 76 products. Is that if things were melted and poured in the United States, they are exempt from the duties. If the aluminum or steel that went into this was melted or poured in the United States, it no longer has to pay this 25%. Well, how do you know that? What does it mean to be melted or poured? Well, melted or poured means where it first went from a liquid state, and then it was poured into a mold and became a cast billet or an ingot or some other kind of primary product of steel or aluminum that then happens to find its way into whatever thing that we later import somewhere down the line. So melted and poured means where is that first kind of smelting operation happening? Where are we taking ores or kind of intermediate ore products, heating them up really hot, and then pouring it into the first molds? Where is that happening the first time? That's what we talk about when we say country of melt and pour. So the U.S. does have some capacity for this, but they don't have as much as other countries in the rest of the world. We get a lot of our steel and aluminum from other places. So if you are going to claim that exclusion, say that, yes, my product was melted or poured in the United States, I would be sure to proactively have your mill certificate or any other kind of backup from your suppliers to say, yes, it was indeed melted and poured in the United States. I'm sure customs will be looking at that exclusion usage very closely. Other things you can start to do now, you may have already been getting questions from your broker about this. How much steel is in it? What's the value of the steel? What are the kilos of the aluminum that's incorporated into it? And you may not know because you may never have been asked before. So start reaching out to your suppliers, start to have your commercial invoices adjusted. That makes your entries go faster for your brokers, faster clearances all the way around. So that also makes it clear for customs when they start to audit it. Just be sure that you have some backup information when it comes to determining those values. Now, we'll come to that in just a moment here. But one other kind of call out from this slide is, I said this again, I'm going to keep saying it, is start to right size your customs bond. So if you haven't reviewed your bond amount in the last 2 months, if you're a Flexport customer, you already would have gotten this. We started reaching out a couple months ago, shortly after the IEEPA tariffs were announced. If you haven't yet gotten that contact from your broker, reach out to us. We can help you make sure you have a good bond size for what you're planning to import in the next 12 months. But that is just an important admin step that nobody thinks about until all of a sudden you can't import anymore because your bond expired. Anyway, so that's my last thing here. But let's talk about what are maybe some of the challenges that come up with 232. What's next? What's just around the door? Well, hopefully we're going to resolve some of the implementation challenges. Now, I will say 232 has mostly gone into effect as indicated, as it should have been. But we are noticing a few cracks around the edges here where maybe this hasn't been quite as smooth. For instance, what if your product is on the derivative list but contains no aluminum whatsoever? Well, it is still mandatory to report the country of melt and pour on that aluminum derivative. So an accessory to a computer is a mouse pad. You're familiar with a mouse pad, squishy foam, textile cover on top, right? I was having to declare the amount of aluminum in a mouse pad because aluminum is an accessory to an automated data processing machine of 8471. So it's a very interesting topic to say, what do I report? There hasn't really been clear guidance on that when there's zero aluminum content in a certain product. We know how to break out the lines. That was clear in some guidance from customs, but that wasn't. A second one that gave me quite a bit of grief last week is that there is a little bit of a discordance between what was programmed and what the Federal Register says. The Federal Register says, hey, these products are subject to these 99 codes. And that should then be programmed in the CBP system. But we've identified at least 8 HTS codes where that was not done correctly, where CBP said it was this 99 code, but in practicality terms, it was actually this other one. So if you're importing bumpers 8708, we may have already talked to you about this, but there could be some more surprises here. I'm sure Customs will clean this up in the next coming few days here. But that is something we are struggling through a little bit, where we're trying to figure out, wait a minute, are we crazy or is Customs crazy? Sometimes it's us, but there's a couple cases when it's Customs for sure. Another big one that I think we had a question on last time, we couldn't quite get to it. I looked into this, I talked to a few people here, and it's the second one. How do we know what value to declare? What value of steel or aluminum in my product do I declare? If I have, a composite good, it's made of steel and plastic, how do I know what the steel value is in that product? Well, is it the procurement cost that I buy it from? Is it the bill of material cost, right? Even the supplier breaks it out. Is it the bill of materials that goes into it, plus the cost of processing that steel if it gets drawn or punched or stamped? Do I have to include that in my cost? Or what if I buy this steel component from a subcontractor? Is it my buy price that I buy that steel component, from the contractor, or is it the, production price from that subcontractor? Frankly, we don't know. We've been getting a few questions on this, and we don't really have a clear guidance from Customs. Several brokerage associations, some of the local chapters, have been reaching out to Customs to try to get a little bit more clarity about what are they going to look for when they say, okay, how do I know what the value is? The best thing we can say right now is be consistent, is have a set method, have it defined, and say this is how we're valuing our product, and do that on every single shipment. You may not get it right at first, but that means you'll at least have a set formula of how we can, go back. And if we do have to make any sort of adjustments or corrections on this, if there's any additional duty that does need to be paid as a result of this, we now at least have some frame of reference on this. We are hoping to get guidance from Customs soon here before we can do so. If you're, already part of a reconciliation program, this is a great thing. You can make sure to revisit in the coming months. You can just make those automatic adjustments. But right now we're a little bit in the dark here about what actually is the correct value to report when it comes to these derivative products. The last one I want to call out, what's next for 232. We've started the investigations into copper and derivative products on this. Remember, 232 is the national security thing here, saying the national defense, saying that we need to have a robust steel and aluminum industry because if we go to war, we want to be able to produce our own steel and aluminum. Well, they're looking at the same thing for copper and timber products. The comment period's open now. It's only open for a couple more weeks, and it includes lumber and paper, lumber and timber, but it also includes paper and wooden furniture and cabinets as part of the scope of this investigation, which is a bit interesting. Who knew that floating shelf you thought was cute at World Market may actually be a threat to our defense industry? Who knew? Other ones we sort of have here are copper derivatives instead. So copper derivatives, we're not quite sure. Does that just mean, intermediate copper products, or does that include wiring kits, boot harnesses? We're not quite sure yet. So this investigation is just starting to take shape now. If you have a vested interest in one way or the other how this comes out, you should consider making comments. You're not required to, but this is kind of your opportunity to do so. The iron is hot, or maybe the steel and aluminum is hot. This is the time to strike. Be sure to make your comments, or choose not to make your comments. If you want more information, we'll put that in the slide notes to people to do so. Okay, well, that's 232. Got a lot more in depth here, but we're going to turn it over to talk about another topic that all of a sudden just kind of rose to importance with these IEEPA tariffs, USMCA. Yeah, Anna, do you want to tell us a little bit about what's going on with USMCA these days?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Marcus. So, as Angela mentioned earlier, goods from Canada and Mexico are subject to the IEEPA tariffs at 10 or 25% of the cost of goods. That went into effect on March 4th. On March 7th, USMCA goods were excluded from the IEEPA tariffs, but that will only apply through April 2nd. So it's still to be determined. I have a little bit of trouble thinking that the tariffs will go into effect on April 2nd without any exclusions because so many U.S. industries depend on Canadian and Mexican goods. Our economies are intertwined significantly, but where we stand today is 25. The USMCA goods are excluded from the tariff measures. You should be aware that no drawback is permitted on the IEEPA tariffs or the 232 tariffs, and that goods entering an FTZ must be entered under privileged foreign status. And we'll talk a little bit on a later slide about specific considerations for that. Just a quick update on the de minimis entry procedures. Goods in Canada were excluded from de minimis treatment under these measures, but on March 2nd, the president delayed implementation until the Secretary of Commerce notified the president that adequate systems are in place to process the entries and collect revenue. We do have an update as of yesterday. CBP programmed a new cargo release message in ACE for entries covering merchandise from excluded countries that will be rejected. So that's one of the first steps in that process. Based on what we saw last week, it's very possible that a notification could be sent overnight to the president, and the next day the tariffs go into, or the new procedure goes into effect. So I do think companies should be considering whether they have a sustainable business process in place to transition de minimis shipments to regular entry procedures if that change comes into place sometime soon. So we did include a section dedicated to USMCA rules of origin, and that is because the tariffs exclude USMCA goods, right? So the USMCA was signed into law in 2020. It permits duty-free entry on qualifying goods, and it exempts USMCA goods from the merchandise processing fees. The agreement has some stronger origin content requires that are specific to, under the product-specific rules, like shirts or other textile materials. The agreement implements a yarn forward rule, meaning if the yarn isn't produced, the yarn used to produce the fabric doesn't come from the USMCA territory, the shirt cannot qualify. There's minimum regional value content requirements and specific rules for automotive industry and chemicals and whatnot. So how do I know if a good is USMCA origin goods? So the USMCA details specific rules of origin for qualifying goods, including whether the good is wholly obtained or produced entirely in the USMCA territory. That could include like natural timber products that are used to make a complete chair would be an example of a good that could be wholly produced in the USMCA territory. You could also have produced entirely in the USMCA territory from originating materials, and then or produced entirely in one or more of the member countries using non-originating materials, which is often the case. And those goods are qualified under the product-specific rules of origin, which ACA, the tariff shift rules. Importantly, to qualify goods for USMCA treatment, goods must be shipped directly to the U.S. from a USMCA member country. Next slide, please. So detailed here are specific considerations for companies. The IEEPA tariff order is limited to products of Canada and Mexico. So you have two different groups of products that could potentially be Canadian or Mexican. You have products that are processed in Canada and Mexico that are not originating under USMCA rules because they don't qualify as a product of Canada and Mexico, and those will not, they would be out of the scope of the IEEPA tariff measures. If you are to, companies could consider completing additional production steps in Canada and Mexico to qualify goods under the USMCA rules of origin to exempt them from the IEEPA tariffs, or you could also potentially reduce the production steps occurring in Mexico so that the goods do not qualify as a good of Canada or Mexico under US non-preferential rules of origin. And the differentiation is that there's two sets of rules that, of origin that may apply to Canadian and Mexican goods. The USMCA rules of origin to qualify for that duty-free treatment, and then the non-preferential rules of origin that determine the national identity of a product. So that's what we're talking about there. You could evaluate alternative sourcing strategies for products of Canada and Mexico, but remember that a substantial transformation is generally required for purposes of applying U.S. trade remedies, such as the 301 tariff measures. So even if a good qualifies under USMCA, you'll want to do a separate substantial transformation analysis to confirm that the goods will not be subject to the 301 tariffs, notwithstanding. There are a number of companies that are not claiming USMCA treatment for qualifying goods. So that could be because the tariffs, the items are tariff rated duty free under normal trade relations rates of duty. One of the benefits under the USMCA is that you also get you avoid paying the merchandise processing fees. So those companies may not, some companies may say it's not worth the cost of compliance for the MPF fees alone, but now that these 25% tariffs are looming, companies should consider qualifying all USMCA goods so that they can avoid the IEEPA tariff measures if that comes into play. I'm going to turn it back over to Angela to talk about our America First policy changes.
Thanks, Anna. So you guys may have heard about America First over the last few weeks, but we haven't really talked about it here before now. So we just wanted to give you guys a bit of context on what appears to be the cornerstone of thinking and planning for the Trump administration. This will probably have a lot of impact on his policy and is expected to be coming out in early April. So the timing is really pertinent. So what is it? America First is an early administration memorandum, which was published on January 20th, that provides guidance to the Secretaries of Treasury, Defense, Commerce, and Homeland Security, as well as the Director of the Office of Management and Budget, U.S. Trade Representative, and the Assistant to the President for Economic Policy and Senior Counsel for Trade and Manufacturing, to assist the administration in establishing a robust and reinvigorated trade policy that promotes investment and productivity, enhances our nation's industrial and technological advantages, defends our economic and national trade security, and, above all, benefits American workers, manufacturers, farmers, ranchers, entrepreneurs, and businesses. So how does the administration expect this to happen? Well, the memorandum itself focuses on three main areas and targets individuals within the notice to provide guidance in these areas. So the first one that they address is unfair and unbalanced trade. Now, this section calls for a lot of things, and honestly, I would encourage everyone to take a look. It's pretty simple to read, but we'll go through some of the highlights here. So addressing unfair and unbalanced trade calls for investigations of trade deficit and unfair trade practices, reviews of free trade agreements, specifically the USMCA, ahead of its July 2026 review, the review of the application of anti-dumping and countervailing laws, loss of tariff revenue due to counterfeit products and illegal drugs due to de minimis, identify countries which the U.S. export market can assess, investigations into currency manipulation, and assessment of the External Revenue Service. The second section focuses on economic and trade relations, specifically with China, and calls for a review of trade and economic agreements between the U.S. and China to ensure that China is acting within said agreements, assessment of a previously completed four-year review of 301 tariffs and potential need for additional tariffs, review of unreasonable or discriminatory acts, policies, or practices by China and appropriate actions to take, and then the assessment of intellectual property rights and ensuring balanced treatment of these within China. The last section focuses on additional economic security matters and calls for an economic insecurity review to assess if possible adjustments on imports are needed that threaten the national security of the United States, assess the effectiveness of exclusions, exemptions, and other import adjustment measures on steel and aluminum, review of the United States export control system and advisement on modifications, and a consideration on information and communication technology on connected vehicles and if expansion on additional products is needed. It also asks for the assessment of impact of foreign governments on financial contributions or subsidies on the United States, and the unlawful migration of fentanyl flows from Canada, Mexico, China, and any other relevant jurisdictions, with the recommended appropriate trade and national security measures to resolve that emergency. So you'll hear a lot of things that are rolled into America First that they've already been moving on, but definitely a lot more context and development to come out of this memorandum. Now, almost all of these reviews and reports are actually due the 1st of April. And it has to be an incredible undertaking for these individuals and agencies to be getting these reports back to the administration by them. But what we want companies to know is you should be prepared for quick and swift changes, though at this time we have no idea what those reports will say or what the changes could be. This is what we believe is the cornerstone of this administration. And if that's not enough, there's definitely a lot more deadlines coming up in the next few weeks. Let's go to the next slide, and I'll turn it back to Marcus for a quick review.
That we are going to watch closely here. March 24, comments are due on the USTR's 301 investigation of Chinese shipbuilding in maritime industry. Hearings will also start to begin shortly after that. So that was a big one. It came out just a couple of weeks ago, took over the TPM conference. Everybody was talking about it. Might have a pretty significant impact, certainly for some shipping lines. Also, comments are due on the notice of proposed rulemaking for 201, 301, 232 IEEPA, and other trade remedies to be excluded from de minimis. So that it would be okay if my product is subject to any one of those acronyms or collection of numbers I just said. You can't claim de minimis on it. You can't bring it in under Type 86, manifest clearances, express consignment, none of those. So that is due on the 24th. It was due yesterday. There was another one about low value shipping. So if you missed that one, it just happened. But there was a second one. This is the second of two proposed rulemakings that just came in January, just before Biden signed off. This is the second one. There's a few more days for comments there. April 1st, in addition to everything on America First that Angela just talked about, almost all of them are due April 1st. A handful are on the 2nd or April 30th or another 180 days, but most of them are due on April 1st. Also, April 1st, I mentioned, is the comments due for the 232 investigations into timber, lumber, and copper derivatives. So if you have thoughts or comments, please be sure to get them in before then. Or at least talk to your industry lobbies. If you don't want to stick your own neck out and be that company, make sure that your industry group does so on your behalf. April 2nd, USMCA exception expires. Now, this is one that we'll all be watching. Everybody go to Truth Social, see what's going to happen. USMCA expiration for IEEPA tariffs, maybe not. We're not sure yet. Maybe it'll continue. Maybe there's enough progress in whatever direction Trump is looking for on the matters of the emergencies at the border that are the underpinning of these tariffs. We'll see. This is the date that is sticking out for a threat of the reciprocal tariffs. This is one that's definitely been looming. This is a big one. Supposedly there should be an announcement around April 2nd. Maybe they need a little bit longer to take a look at this, but we will see. TBD on de minimis being removed for China, Canada, or Mexico. All those three IEEPA measures, the national security emergency measures, said, okay, we're also going to suspend de minimis for these countries of origin. And then they walked it back a couple of days later, said no. There is one thing that Anna mentioned in passing that's going to reiterate, right, is that if there was some programming updates made in ACE yesterday that would allow for more Type 86, cargo release rejections, if they have a disqualified country of origin. So that's not an announcement that it's live, but you can tell in the background Customs is preparing to be able to suspend this at some future date. So we don't have anything to announce yet here, but wheels are moving, and they're moving toward restricting de minimis a bit further. So I guess just pause here. I mean, Anna, what's your take? Are there certain things that are maybe either on this list, off this list? What's something that's keeping you up at night? What's maybe something you'd want our audience to hear maybe a little bit more about and really kind of be focused on?
Yeah, I mean, I think the major thing is to have a compliance procedure and make sure your compliance procedure and process can support some of the changes so that you don't have compliance gaps. A lot of times we see something slips through the cracks in an importing scenario and results in a prior disclosure years later, and nobody wants that because of unpredictable costs. You can't change your pricing retroactively to a customer in the U.S. I do think the 232 tariffs, something that you mentioned earlier today, what's in or out in terms of steel and aluminum. There are steel products of Chapter 73 with no explicit exclusion for non-steel components or aluminum, even though we know that like electronics and other plastic materials are not the scope of this investigation. There does seem to be a disparity between the treatment of goods of Chapter 73 and other non-steel or aluminum chapters. So, and even for goods in those chapters with a known exclusion for, the non-steel or aluminum content, how do we apply that in practice? Because, like Marcus, you said, I had a conversation yesterday with a client that's like, should I include the cost of the steel billet? My steel is not even coming from China. It's coming from somewhere in Europe. They buy that, and then my fabricator takes the steel or aluminum and makes something completely different. There's finishing costs for that steel. We have a client that anneals steel so that it can withstand 950-degree temperatures. A lot of companies, when you talk to them, they're like, oh, the weight is not that big of a deal. But actually, the value of the steel compared to everything else, like the raw steel only, is significantly less than the total landed cost because of all of those services and processing. So we're working with a number of clients to obtain clarity or submit a ruling request for their specific facts and circumstances to get a definitive answer. Some companies think, well, why don't we just wait and see what happens? But the drawback to that is, again, you cannot retroactively change your product pricing. So you really do want some sort of definitive practice in place so that you can make some decisions.
Yep. Yeah. Angela, what about you?
All of it, quite frankly, is keeping me up a little bit at night. I think for me, it's about, the additional reciprocal tariffs, how that would be implemented. The tariff book is large as it is. We've already seen with 232, and obviously this is very complex with the derivatives, but implementation has not been as smooth as we would like as brokers, right? There's a lot of clarity that's lacking. Shipments are definitely in a state where they're a little stuck, where we're waiting for more insight. We want to be as compliant as possible, but we don't really have the directions to know exactly how to go about this. Importers are absolutely in the same place. So really, it's all about, for me, the rollout and the speed and timing of which any changes occur to make sure that, customs is prepared, and that we have the time to make sure that we're communicating the process out to our organizations and out to our importers. For me, I'm really interested to see if the USMCA exception will actually expire. I was kind of shocked that the 25% went into effect this month. So would I be shocked now to watch USMCA expire? Not necessarily, but at the same time, I do feel it's highly detrimental to all economies. And so I'm definitely watching that very closely. But, the additional reciprocal tariffs, how those could be rolled out, and the timing of when is really what I'm kind of on the edge of my seat about. And Marcus, what about you?
Yeah, I'm gonna try to be hipster and try to pick something not on the list here, and kind of look at the outbound investment rules that were that are being reviewed again as part of the U.S. The America First policy. So under the Biden administration, they want to look at outbound investment into specific areas, mostly semiconductor manufacturing, AI creation generation tools, supercomputing, quantum computing. A lot of those outbound investment from the U.S. to other countries, or specifically China, is now banned. Some of them are just restricted. Some of them you need permission to do so. And what came in this America First thing is they're reviewing that one a little bit more closely. Now, how do I tie this back to importers? Most of us probably aren't investing in AI and supercomputing overseas. The reason for doing so is on national security grounds. And national security seems to also be a big theme of both America First and quite a lot of what the administration's been doing to date, right? IEEPA is a response to a national emergency over fentanyl and immigration crises, right? 232 duties that just got expanded are in response to making sure our national defense is able to have a healthy and robust steel and aluminum industry. They're looking at national defense now for copper and wooden products. The national defense implications of paper, right, as a lumber derivative or wooden furniture. That's interesting. The definition of what is in the national defense interest seems to be a little bit more fluid early on in the Trump administration. So I'm curious if this one is also getting going to see any more substantive changes. Is this just kind of a look back at everything that Biden did, or is this maybe a little bit more to try to see what other kinds of investments may be scrutinized, especially as maybe importers want to say, okay, we have to close down our Chinese factory, but now we want to open something up in Malaysia. Am I going to be affected? Too soon to say, but I'm very curious to see how those rules end up shaking out. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot to do by April 1st as well. It's,
Yeah.
it's going to be interesting
Yeah.
to see how inclusive these reports are, substantial versus, if they just focus on some key areas that are kind of the underlying targets. But I absolutely agree, Marcus. I think the question is, in the 301 tariffs of the first administration, a lot of Chinese companies moved out of China into other countries, right? And I think that America First, some of the underpinnings of that allows the administration to really take a hard look at China and see if there's anything that they have done through the original 301s that they could now enforce or implement additional tariffs on. So that to me will be really interesting.
Angela, that's a really good point too. Also, a lot of companies are shifting production to Vietnam or Malaysia or other Asian countries. We know that Vietnam exports more steel to the U.S. than they have production capabilities. For example, the solar cell. There's lots of anti-dumping evasion investigations involving like adjacent countries. So like when you're considering changing your supply chain, make sure you have effective controls that go beyond representations. For example, is the factory really there? Do they have these capabilities and equipment to produce the steel, right? So don't just assume that something is. You need to get out there and have boots on the ground and make sure that you have someone local in country that can really, kind of shore up these details. And even so, also, I had a call this week with a client. They're saying, well, the supplier says the country of origin is Vietnam. I'm worried that it might be Chinese. And that is exactly the question, right? Like, have you looked at the supplier's documentation to verify the country of origin, especially in the current environment? We have had situations where customs will target specific products and issue a request for information and ask for bills of material, production costs, hours. And sometimes you can't get that information after the fact. So really, shoring up those details up front is going to help insulate you from unexpected costs at later stages.
Yeah. Yeah. I know for some of those value ones, I had an audit early in my, or it was part of an importer audit early in my career. They asked for the time cards. This is in relation to AGOA, but that's what they can sometimes look for, is like, show me the time cards where they're actually paying wages here in Vietnam versus some other place. So that is definitely a concern. So Anna, what other things maybe should we look at? What other things can importers do here? As they go forward, how can they look for the cost, right? Because 232 duties are all based on cost. How can they sort of manage this? What other options are out there for them?
Yeah, so maybe we listed our top 10 considerations for managing customs duty as a cost of goods sold here. We don't have time to go through all of them, but I think I'm going to just touch on the top 3, which I think are value classification and country of origin. So verify your product classifications. Oftentimes companies defer that responsibilities to their brokers, but brokers don't have access to your full product details. It's not a step that you should wait till embed within a process. It should be done upfront and proactively so that you know exactly what your duty rates will be. But also the tariff classification not only determines the normal trade relations rates of duty, they determine all of these other tariff measures like the applicability of Section 301 tariffs, whether they're 0, 7.5, or 25%. They determine the applicability of the Section 232 tariff measures, like some steel and aluminum products or derivative products are not on the list. So not all steel and aluminum products are impacted by these tariff measures, right? So make sure your classifications are correct. Review your supplier documentation to confirm the country of origin independently, maybe do a sampling just to make sure that you understand your risk. Document that in an agreement with your supplier. If you make any production or sourcing changes, you need to tell me before you do it so that I can review it under the U.S. rules of origin. And then consider qualifying goods as originating obviously under FTA rules of origin to minimize duty liability. And lastly, review your valuation policies. Make sure that if you're doing business between intercompany sales, make sure that your transfer price can be supported under the customs rules, and also think about whether you're providing assist to companies to a manufacturer to incorporate into a finished goods. How are you capturing that in your process? I think one thing that's really interesting is there is some really harsh language in these orders about enforcement. So the standard of care is reasonable care, right? So you don't have to be perfect. And customs does have a responsibility to inform the trade completely of its obligations and how to comply. There's a lot of, you heard today, there is a lot of ambiguity. So, go out, review the guidance that customs has ask for rulings. If you need it, review informed compliance publications, but really, be proactive. You don't have to be perfect, but if information becomes available later, you will be expected to make those adjustments. So consider what you can do upfront proactively to manage your total cost of goods sold. And if you have questions about any of the recommendations or considerations that we've outlined here, definitely give us a call. We can help. So I guess with that, we can go ahead and, can we go to the next slide for the ACE analysis? So our team, oftentimes we talk to clients and they're like, where do I start? You really should focus on, do I focus on the highest value or highest duty rate? We're recommending to clients, go ahead and run an ACE analysis. An ACE analysis is simply the information and data that the government collects on your import entry. So you can define a product by a tariff classification, and you can evaluate the value of merchandise by classification and the total amount of duties paid. Using that report, our BD team, Flexport, offers its clients a totally free and ACE analysis. They'll go ahead and run it through a dashboard and give you like 30 different lines of sight to your data to help focus your efforts. You don't want to boil the ocean here, but really figure out what things should I be thinking about and focus on those highest value duty rated items. So with that, let's hop to the Q&A.
Yeah, let's see what we got. Anna, we got a first pair here for you talking about value, what you just recommended here, specifically talking about the 232. I kind of took this on a little bit here, but should the value of aluminum be the gross amount in the bill of materials or the net amount of the finished product, excluding what was trimmed off? Follow-up, should the value of the aluminum include the supplier's procurement costs for the transportation and customs from the, suppliers' procurement costs such as for transportation and customs from source to their factory? How do you do that? How should importers be preparing, especially with this 232 ambiguity about value reporting?
Yeah, so exactly. So this is what I was kind of touched on earlier. There is no definitive guidance, clearly, and when you produce an aluminum and steel product, you start with a raw material, and then that raw material goes through a lot of processing, finishing, coating, painting applications. So there's wraparound services that change the form and shape of the steel, right? So what we're recommending to clients is there's no guidance. So the only way to obtain guidance is to ask CBP for a ruling. And because your facts and circumstances may vary from product or company to company, we can work with you to draw that out in a ruling request so that you can, you really want to just pick apart that, chip away at the value and say these are in or out in terms of the 25% tariffs.
Yeah. Okay. Angela, we also have one here for you, maybe all of us, but could you talk about updates on the upcoming reciprocal tariff April 2nd? Is there a list of countries and products affected? What do we know?
Yeah, so April 2nd isn't a definitive date. I mean, this has been threatened by Trump that reciprocal tariffs will come out. I think the main things to look for here are the new tariffs that will be coming out or will be stated by the EU. Like I said, they're taking a two-pronged approach on the 232 reciprocal tariffs, and they're doing an assessment right now, which we should probably hear back on additional tariffs of additional products. But also, let's see how much they capitulate in the next 2 weeks before their first list of tariffs go into effect. As I talked about, Trump's already said 200% on alcohol. Let's see what happens and what the negotiations are like there. I think that is probably going to be the most immediate tariffs that we could see. But then we're also waiting for a lot of these reports from America First to see what actually happens and what the advice and the recommendations of these secretaries and USTR is. Could it roll out immediately? Absolutely. This is a Trump administration. Let's not get too relaxed in thinking we have a ton of time. But I will say, there's a lot that they're scoping here. There's a lot they're looking at. So there could be some immediate rollout of some certain specific countries or certain products. Hopefully the administration will use this as a way to take some time and analyze the whole situation. And we'll get a little bit more time to see what the new tariffs may be and from where. But at this point, we do not know.
Marcus, earlier in the call, you mentioned the former European tariffs in the Boeing matter, Boeing Airbus matter. I mean, you can look, I think it's also it's more complicated than people realize. The US, there's a lot of US high value companies that provide digital services to European customers that don't pay any taxes because they don't have nexus in those countries. So the US also has a lot to lose in terms, it's not as simple as saying like, let's do a product to product comparison, because the US has the most companies with digital IP type services and we don't pay any taxes in the EU. So it's very possible, just like Canada said, we're going to cut off your electricity or we're going to charge you more. The European Union could say, hey, we're going to charge you a digital service tax, and it will really hurt, just like the measures are focused on alcohol and, other luxury items. They can more broadly hit companies that aren't paying any taxes.
Yeah. Yep. We saw those same luxury items were threatened back in 2019 again.
Yeah.
And then they off-ramped into the generally acceptable or generally applicable exclusion category for 232. Didn't seem like that was very happy this time around. So we'll definitely have to see how that shakes out. I got one here. There's kind of a couple in the same category about HTS and 232. So how can I tell if our product HTS number falls under the new Section 232 tariffs? I put that, there are two links in the slides on 232s that link to the Federal Register where these announcements are, where they say, okay, these are the products that are affected, here's the HTS codes, and then here's the special 99 codes that go into place. If you have specific questions for, a couple HTS codes or some of your products, send it over, we can take a look at it and run some VLOOKUPs. The other one here is saying, does the steel and aluminum 25% tariff, is it applicable only to HTS codes for steel and aluminum listed in Federal Register Annex 1? So this is an answer where I say technically yes, but I would note that all those adjustments that went into effect on March 12 were adjustments to Annex 1. So it is still applicable to Annex 1 as it always has, but the things on Annex 1 became more numerous. They just added more things to the bottom. So technically yes, but don't be misled. This is still an expansion. More things are in scope. All right, let's see what we got next here. Would these exclusion transactions also be subject to increased scrutiny or not? Yes, or audit. Yes, it looks like, I think I said so on that slide. For the exclusion, so if your product was melted or poured, if the steel and aluminum that went into your derivative product was melted or poured in the U.S., there is an exclusion for that. You don't have to pay the 25% on it. Do I think it's going to be scrutinized? Absolutely. Knowing that globally, steel and aluminum capacity like the U.S. does make up some, but it doesn't make up the majority, and barely even a plurality of it in most cases. It is probably going to be scrutinized. Now, an audit is a little bit more of a formal review process. It probably goes along with notice of investigation, CF-28s. There's probably some other trimmings and trappings that come along with a real customs audit. But yes, that is probably something they look for in terms of what you'd want to keep on hand. Give the life cycle of that product. Okay, so it arrived here on this date and it contains this aluminum component in it. Well, where was that aluminum machined? Okay, where did that machine shop get their aluminum billet from? Okay, where was that aluminum billet melted? Right, be able to follow that all the way back. And I know that's a lot to ask, but I do think if you want the best defense, that's what CBP is going to look for.
Yeah, and I'll just add quickly too, Marcus, we have heard that CBP will get more funding this year. So we shouldn't rest on our laurels thinking this is too much. How are they going to control it? This, the administration is showing signs of support for enforcement of CBP, and they will do so through funding and additional employees. So expect that enforcement to be something that they really go after this year.
Yeah, and I just want to add like one more color commentary. I wouldn't expect a matter like this to jump automatically from an entry to an audit. Usually the way these things unfold is a request for information. And then if customs doesn't agree with your response or think it's sufficient to support an exclusion, then they're going to rate advance that entry, and they're going to tell you go back and identify all your other entries and fix them too. If you don't do that, that would result in a referral potentially to the Department of Justice and FP&F.
Yep. Anna, a question for you about ACE analysis here. Is the ACE analysis only for U.S. imports, or can this or something like it also be requested for U.S. to EU imports?
Yeah, there are. Flexport, I don't think has a process in place for EU, but there are. You kind of have to go country by country to see which ones have like reporting capabilities. But you can request your data for specific EU countries. There are processes that exist.
Yeah, we've actually been standing up the process for EU as well. So not all countries.
Oh, yeah?
But we have like you said, Anna, there are processes to request information. In the US, you have ACE. Unfortunately, in other countries, sometimes information is still sent on a USB stick or a floppy drive. So we have stood up ACE analysis for other countries as well. The UK being the first one that we're doing it for. You can also get a firm's report in Canada. And so that is information that we can obtain on your behalf, or you can obtain, and we can do the ACE analysis. Caveat here, the other countries take much more time. You will never complain about ACE when you start to deal with some of these other countries. ACE is very quick, so we can do that one very quickly. But contact us and we can talk to you about your countries and possibly doing a similar, though not quite as robust analysis that may take a little bit longer.
Angela, that's because I'm sorry, Anna, but just to clarify, that's because the EU is a trade bloc, but each country collects their own data. Is that right? Is that correct?
Yes, I believe that is the case because every country has their own data. Yeah.
Who should clients contact, Angela, for this? Do they still go through the BD department?
Yeah, the BD department. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. And I just want to call out, we included in the appendix a slide with contact information for our classification team, trade advisory, or the BD team. So that is there. You can send an email to them and ask questions as needed.
Sorry, I do see one here that I want to grab here down toward the bottom of the list I just saw come in. Are all tariffs, including the America First policies, done through executive order, or will some go through Congress? This is a $1 trillion question. Are all tariffs, including America First, going through executive order? Will they go through? So all the stuff a part of America First, that's within executive agencies. And so whether that's an executive order that becomes a notice of proposed rulemaking by one of these agencies, that's probably the more likely way. That's how like some of these 301s, for instance, came into place. Like 301 has an outlined investigation. USTR needs to look into these things, find certain circumstances exist, and then decide what are the recommended actions that the president will then implement pursuant to Section 301. So that's kind of one possible method here, but will some of it go through Congress? Government 101 time, Article 1, Section 8 does say that Congress shall have the power to levy taxes, raise duties. They have the power of the purse. They are the ones who set it. When the president increases tariffs, they are doing so only by the specifically delegated authority given to the president by Congress. So Congress and at the drop of a hat, could, in theory anyway, take all that power back or significantly restrict it or say, no, Mr. President, you can't do it that way anymore. You have to do it this way. The other thing that's coming up right now is because it's budget negotiation time. Budget rules in the House say that any new spending or tax reductions need to have an offset. Well, if something is, if you're with a revenue boost or some other kind of spending cut, so if you want to try to offset this, Congress could try to bring in some of these tariffs as part of a pay for in some of these circumstances where they could say, okay, in order to provide $100 billion of tax cuts over here, we have to raise $100 billion of revenue over here. Well, let's just set these, a 10% tariff across the board, and that gets us pretty much a pay for, so we can do this tax cut over here. That's the game that is a possible scenario here. However, it would be much slower going. Once that's written into law, the president, unless the law is written a certain way, the president couldn't just adjust that unilaterally. So if you think the president is using tariffs as a negotiation tool, well, that kind of ties his hands if it's written in law by Congress. That just happens to be the rate that gets set. So that's a really juicy question. Thanks for asking that one. That was a really fun one to take a look at here. Sorry, I'm just going to do real quick on de minimis. We didn't really touch on that too much. Current state of de minimis is that as of today, this webinar, it's still allowed for all countries, but somebody also astutely pointed out, hey, wasn't there a restriction coming? Yes, there is. Isn't this a necessary step? Yeah, they are building out the tooling, the processes in place to be able to restrict based on countries of origin. They experimented with it for a couple days. There were issues. They are working to try to resolve these issues more proactively. It is not in effect yet, but it does clearly suggest a direction. They're moving toward a goal of being able to restrict de minimis for, probably China and some other countries. Still a little bit unknown as to when or what it looks like, but yes, as of right now, it's still allowed. Restrictions should be expected. Okay, and with that, I know we are at time here, so that concludes today's webinar. Thank you, everybody, for attending. A reminder to please share your feedback in the survey linked above. We will email everyone a link to the recording tomorrow. Thank you again. Have a great day.
Thanks all.